Well, this National Local Government Intervention Workshop comes after holding a provincial local government workshop 2 weeks ago by the governing party. As you see, the ANC saying it wants to understand why so many councils are failing. I probably don't need to tell you how in so many parts of the country roads are falling apart, electricity and water services are failing, and we all know municipalities often can't manage their own money. Professor Friedman is a political analyst. He joins me now. Professor Friedman, good afternoon to you. When the ANC says it wants to understand why so many councils are failing, where do you believe it should look? The ANC's critics are going to say it needs to start by looking at itself.
Good afternoon, Stephen. Well, I think, obviously it's the governing party, but I think that everybody who is looking at local government at the moment, or many people are looking at local government, aren't looking at where they should look. And essentially, in one line, where they should look is to the citizenry, who, after all, are the people who elect local government in the first place. Because if you strengthen the citizenry, then you strengthen local government. There is a context to this, and the context of this is that one of the reasons why local government is as it is that we have an economy which is not very good at producing opportunities and not very good at producing jobs, and therefore people who can't get on in the private sector as they would if the private sector was functioning without the barriers to entry which it has. Those people would go into business, but now they go into local government because I often make the point that if you want to understand a lot of local government in this country, you have to realize that for many people, the difference between being a councillor and losing your seat is the difference between being middle class and poor. And that obviously means that councillors spend most of their time worrying about the party leaderships who will decide whether they're middle class or poor or not. What we really need is a situation in which they have to worry about voters and then worrying about whether voters will allow them to remain in the middle class or not, or relegate them to poverty. So we need to look at strengthening citizen voice. We need to look at strengthening citizen access to information. I mean, there's a checklist of things we could be doing, but only if we recognize that strong citizens are what make local government work.
Do we also need to change any of the structure of our councils, the way that councillors are elected, where usually in the metros half of them would need to be in the good books of party bosses, the other half would represent wards, but even they would need the okay from party bosses? Do we need to weaken party bosses, or would strengthening citizenry be enough?
No, I don't. Well, the point is that the stronger citizens are, the weaker party bosses are. I don't think changing the system will do any good. I mean, obviously you're right that a PR councillor is put there by the party leadership, but presumably PR councillors are capable of working out that if their representation drops in the council, then there won't be that many PR seats available anyway. So even they, need to care about citizens more than they do. But it seems to me that we're always looking for these technical fixes. You tweak the law a bit, or you complain that people don't have the right educational qualifications, which actually has nothing to do with your ability to represent your fellow citizens adequately. And we don't look at the basics. I mean, does the average person particularly in shack settlements and townships in this country, do they have the means of holding their local councillor to account? And if they don't have the means of doing that, how do we make sure that they do have the means of doing that, barring, of course, the way in which people tend to do this, try to do this at the moment, which is taking to the streets. There's nothing wrong with taking to the streets, but we should have a system in which people don't need to take to the streets in order to hold to account those who they vote into office.
There are other problems, of course, Professor, as I'm sure you know better than I do. Some councils, for example, just don't have the revenue base. They really are never going to be able to, they don't have enough people earning from the private sector, as you point out, to the point where they'll be able to get enough money to pay services. And at the same time, if someone decided, or if the governing party or whoever decided, we're going to literally redistrict councils, I can't imagine the arguments there would be.
Well, indeed. But the point is that here is an area in which we could do a bit of tweaking, we could be quite creative. And there are 2 points which I think are important. The one that we have to bear in mind is that the job of a local councillor is to represent people. It's not to provide services. It's not to be a mechanic. It's not to be a water engineer. It's to represent people. And therefore, we have to make sure that people are able to do that representing. Now, one way in which we can look at is that there are systems around the world in which not all local governments, for example, have the same powers. Where your powers depend on the size of your revenue base. It depends on the resources you have available. And therefore, what a big metropolitan council would be able to do would be far more than what a rural district council could do. Yes, you're right, there would be pushback against that, but then those people who push back against it must explain why we have a system at the moment where, for example, in some of the poorer councils, either you appoint a municipal manager who doesn't have the right qualifications, and officials do need qualifications, unlike representatives, or you appoint somebody who does have the right qualifications, but then you have to pay them double everybody else, and then everybody says that you're being corrupt. So that's one of many examples of how the current system doesn't work. The other thing we could look at is what is called public-public partnerships. So in other words, instead of some of these smaller municipalities actually providing electricity and water themselves, for example, you would have the utilities providing them, and then the council would negotiate on behalf of residents to ensure that the price was affordable to residents and that the quality was of the required standard. So there are things we can do to make it easier to represent people. But I think that we must always remember that representing people is fundamentally what this is all about.
It's interesting, of course, that some councils in South Africa are better run than others, and this probably, Professor, takes us deep into political territory, because it is clear from the Auditor General's report that the majority of those that are well run in the Western Cape, and they're run by the Democratic Alliance. Why are some councils better run than others? Is it because the citizens are stronger?
Stephen, I only make a comment as a citizen. I mean, I know that this is continually the claim. All I can tell you is that, like you, I am a resident of Johannesburg, which of course has been under DA control, ANC control, in-between control, etc. I, as a citizen, can't tell the difference, quite frankly. I mean, I sometimes have to remind myself who's in power so that I know who to complain about if I drive over a pothole. You know, I'm not convinced, quite frankly, that this idea that party X is good and party Y is bad really gets us where we need to be. It is certainly true that if you have resources, which in the Cape Town metropolitan area they have, where you have a much higher degree of political support for the council than you do in some other areas, because I think that to be specific, I think that DA councils in the Western Cape, for all sorts of political reasons we could discuss, have greater citizen buy-in than ANC councils do in Gauteng, when there were ANC councils in Gauteng. And indeed, ANC councils in the Free State, if we look at what's been happening in Mangaung. I think those factors do come into play. But you see, the one thing which I think does make a difference, and I think that very often people in some of the major cities complain more than they ought to, because they get much higher in the suburbs, they get much higher levels of service than they do in the townships. And the reason for that is, quite frankly, that the middle-class city dwellers in particular know how to push the buttons. As you should, as everybody should be able to do. So that if things go wrong in the suburbs, people take to WhatsApp groups or pick up the phone or go online and complain. It's a lot more difficult to do that in some other areas in the country. So I think you tend to find that in cases where you do have an organized middle class, and B, your ideal situation for the middle class is the Western Cape, where not only is the middle class organised, but the party that the middle class voted for is actually the party running the city, then you're probably going to have outcomes people are satisfied with. But the point that I'm making in all of these examples is that this is about politics. It's not about management skills. It's not about who's been to which university. It's about how politics plays out in our municipalities.
Professor Stephen Friedman, thank you very much indeed. The political analyst, really do appreciate the time.